August 15th, 1973, First Federal Bank of Memphis. A young black woman stands at the teller window, her hands trembling as she slides a crumpled napkin across the marble counter. The teller, a clean-cut white man in his 30s, unfolds it carefully. His eyes widen. His jaw drops because there, scrawled in bold handwriting across a diner napkin, is a bank draft for $10,000. Signed, Elvis Presley. $10,000. In 1973, that's enough to buy a house. That's more money than most families in Memphis see in 2 years. And it's being handed over by a 19-year-old waitress who makes $2 an hour plus tips. Her name is Violet Johnson. 24 hours earlier, she was invisible. Another face in the crowd, another young black woman in the segregated South, told to know her place, keep her head down, and never, ever reach for something beyond her station. She had asked Elvis Presley for something so simple, so innocent, that what happened next would expose the hidden heart of the king of rock and roll and set off a firestorm that would challenge everything America thought it knew about race, class, and human decency. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of courage can shatter the biggest lies we tell ourselves. And sometimes, when the world is watching, a single moment of kindness can change absolutely everything. This is the story of that napkin. This is the story of what happened when a young black waitress dared to ask Elvis Presley for help. And this is the story of what he did next that stopped America in its tracks. But to understand how we got to that bank window, to understand why a crumpled diner napkin became front-page news across the country, we need to go back. We need to understand who Violet Johnson really was. And we need to understand just how impossible her dreams seemed before everything changed. Her alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m. every morning, but Violet Johnson had been awake for hours. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford when your mind never stopped calculating. Rent due in 3 days, $48. Grandmother's heart medication, $37. Sister's school supplies, $15. Her paycheck from Louise's Cafe, $62, if she was lucky with tips. The math never worked. It hadn't worked for 7 years, not since her mother died and left her to raise her 12-year-old sister Maya while caring for their ailing grandmother. Not since her father disappeared into the bottom of a bourbon bottle, chasing ghosts and leaving behind nothing but empty promises and unpaid bills. Every morning, Violet would stare at the water-stained ceiling of their cramped apartment and do the same calculation. Every morning, she came up short. Every morning, she got up anyway. Louise's Cafe sat on the wrong side of Memphis, where the neon signs buzzed with broken letters and the dreams came secondhand. It was the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee that could strip paint, where factory workers grabbed lunch between shifts, where everyone knew everyone else's business but pretended not to see each other's pain. For Violet, it was purgatory, 8 hours on her feet, serving plates of greasy food to customers who looked through her like she was part of the furniture. 8 hours of, "Yes, sir," and "Right away, ma'am," and swallowing every insult, every dismissive glance, every cruel joke about what a colored girl was doing with dreams above her station. Because Violet Johnson had a secret. Hidden under her mattress, between the pages of her mother's old Bible, was an acceptance letter. Memphis Medical College. Nursing program. Full tuition. $2,800. It might as well have been $2 million. She'd earned that letter through night school, through correspondence courses paid for with tip money, through staying up until 2 a.m. studying anatomy while Maya slept and Grandma Rose wheezed in the next room. She'd earned it through perfect grades and recommendation letters from teachers who believed in her potential. But potential doesn't pay tuition. And in 1973 Memphis, being brilliant while black and poor was just another way of being invisible. The regular customers at Louise's made sure she understood her place. There was Mr. Thompson, who snapped his fingers when he wanted service and left exact change, never a penny more. Mrs. Patterson, who complained if her coffee wasn't hot enough, her eggs weren't perfect enough, her toast wasn't buttered to her exact specifications. And then there were the young men, barely older than Violet herself, who made jokes about what other services a girl like her might provide if the price was right. Violet absorbed it all with the same practiced smile. She'd learned early that survival meant swallowing your pride with every cup of coffee you poured, every plate you served, every insult you pretended not to hear. She'd learned that being angry was a luxury she couldn't afford. Being proud was dangerous. Being hopeful was the cruelest joke of all. But late at night, when the cafe was closed and Memphis slept, Violet would take out that acceptance letter and read it again. She would trace the letterhead with her finger and imagine herself in a crisp white uniform, helping people heal, making a difference. She would imagine her grandmother getting the medicine she needed, her sister going to college, all of them finally having enough. Then, morning would come, and she'd fold the letter away, put on her waitress uniform, and disappear into another day of being nobody special. August 14th, 1973. The summer heat in Memphis was the kind that made the air shimmer, that made your clothes stick to your skin before you'd even stepped outside. The afternoon thunderstorm had passed, leaving the streets steaming and the sky that peculiar shade of gray that promised more rain before nightfall. Louise's cafe was in that dead zone between lunch and dinner, when the only customers were the regulars nursing coffee and complaints, and the jukebox played the same scratchy records on endless repeat. Violet was wiping down tables for the 100th time, her back aching, her feet screaming, when Margaret Collins nudged her elbow. "Girl, you see that car outside?" Violet glanced through the grease-stained window. A pink Cadillac sat gleaming in the parking lot like it had descended from another planet. Even through the haze of cigarette smoke and fryer grease, it looked impossibly clean, impossibly expensive, impossibly out of place. "Probably some rich folks slumming it," Violet murmured, but something in her chest fluttered, because she'd seen that car before. Everyone in Memphis had seen that car before. On television, in magazines, cruising down Beale Street like a beautiful, untouchable dream. The bell above the door chimed, and the world shifted. He walked in, wearing a simple white jumpsuit instead of his famous sequins, but there was no mistaking those eyes. Green as bottle glass, tired in a way that spoke of too many nights under too many lights, but kind. Elvis Presley stepped into Louise's cafe like he belonged there, like he wasn't the most famous man in America walking into a nowhere diner on the wrong side of Memphis. The cafe went silent. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Coffee cups paused at lips. Even the jukebox seemed to hold its breath. Elvis surveyed the room with those careful eyes, taking in the cracked vinyl booths, the water-stained ceiling tiles, the faces of people who had never expected to see him anywhere but on a screen. He nodded once, politely, and slid into a corner booth like he was just another customer. But he wasn't just another customer. He was Elvis Presley, and Violet Johnson, invisible waitress with impossible dreams, was about to serve him coffee. Margaret grabbed Violet's arm so hard it left marks. "You have to serve him," she whispered, her eyes wide with excitement and terror. "You have to get his table." Violet's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her order pad. She dreamed about meeting Elvis Presley the way every girl in America had dreamed about meeting Elvis Presley. But dreams were safe. Dreams didn't require you to walk across a room full of judging eyes and actually speak to your hero. "I can't," she whispered back. "What if I mess up? What if I say something stupid?" "What if you don't?" Margaret shot back. "Violet, when is this ever going to happen again? When are you ever going to get another chance like this?" And that was the question, wasn't it? When would life ever offer her another miracle? When would the universe ever again put something this extraordinary within reach? Violet smoothed her worn uniform, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and walked toward the corner booth. Each step felt like walking through quicksand. The other customers watched her approach with predatory interest, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for her to prove that some people should know their place. Elvis looked up as she approached, and his face softened into a smile that reached all the way to his tired eyes. "Afternoon, miss." "Good afternoon, sir." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "What can I get you?" "Coffee, black. And maybe some of that pie." if it's any good. The apple pie's fresh today. Made it myself this morning. He raised an eyebrow, impressed. Well then, I'll definitely have a slice of that. She wrote down the order, her hands still trembling slightly, and turned to go, but something made her pause. Something made her look back at this man who had everything, who could go anywhere, who had chosen to spend his afternoon in a nowhere cafe, being served by a nobody waitress. And maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the acceptance letter hidden under her mattress. Maybe it was the knowledge that miracles don't come knocking twice. But Violet Johnson found her courage. "Sir?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I hate to bother you, but would it be possible to get an autograph? I know everyone probably asks, but..." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Around them, the cafe held its breath. And then, from a table of regulars who'd been watching the whole exchange, came the sound that would haunt her dreams: laughter. Cruel, mocking, deliberate laughter that cut through the silence like a knife. "Look at that." The voice belonged to Billy Crawford, a regular who spent more time at Louise's than at his own home. "Girl thinks she's special now." The laughter spread like poison through the cafe, table by table, customer by customer, until the sound surrounded Violet like a pack of wolves circling wounded prey. Her cheeks burned with shame as the words hit her from all directions. "Everybody wants something from him," sneered Mrs. Patterson, the woman who complained about everything and tipped nothing. "Can't even let the man eat his pie in peace." "That's what happens when they don't know their place," muttered Thompson from behind him an inch. But it was young Jimmy Walsh who delivered the cruelest cut of all. 22 years old, full of beer and bravado, he stood up from his booth and called out loud enough for the whole cafe to hear, "Hey Elvis, careful with that one. She's probably got her hand in your pocket already." The laughter roared louder. Violet felt her world collapsing inward, felt every fear she'd ever had about reaching too high, about wanting too much, about forgetting her place in the carefully ordered hierarchy of 1970s Memphis, crashing down around her ears. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to drop her order pad, tear off her apron, and flee into the steaming August afternoon. She wanted to disappear, to become invisible again, to go back to being nobody special with nobody's expectations to disappoint. But her feet were rooted to the worn linoleum floor. Her grandmother needed medicine. Her sister needed school supplies. She needed this job, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how small it made her feel. So she stood there and absorbed the cruelty with the same practiced smile she'd worn for 7 years. Until she made the mistake of looking at Elvis. Something dangerous flickered in those green eyes, something that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Elvis Presley had heard every word, seen every sneer, watched every moment of Violet's humiliation unfold. And the expression on his face was not the polite smile of a celebrity trying to keep the peace. It was the expression of a man who had been poor once, who had been looked down on once, who remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, to be told he wasn't good enough, to be laughed at by people who thought they were better than him. The laughter died as Elvis slowly, deliberately stood up from his booth. He wasn't tall, barely 5'10" in his boots, but something about his presence made him seem to fill the entire cafe. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the jukebox had gone quiet. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive drawl, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "You asked me for an autograph." Violet nodded, not trusting her voice. That's a reasonable request from a hard-working young lady. His eyes swept the room, landing on each laughing face with surgical precision. "I don't see anything funny about it." Billy Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Patterson suddenly found her coffee cup fascinating. Jimmy Walsh, who had been so bold moments before, was now studying his hands like they held the secrets of the universe. Elvis reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a gold pen. But instead of asking for paper, he did something unexpected. He reached across the table and picked up a white paper napkin from the dispenser. A cheap, thin diner napkin that probably cost a penny. The cafe watched in absolute silence as Elvis spread the napkin on the table and began to write. But he wasn't just signing his name. His pen moved across the paper for long seconds, far too long for a simple autograph. He wrote with deliberate care, pressing hard enough that his words wouldn't smudge or fade. When he finished, he looked up at Violet, and his expression had softened back into something gentle, something protective. "What's your name, miss?" "Violet," she whispered. "Violet Johnson." He smiled, not the practiced smile of a performer, but something real and warm. "That's a beautiful name. My mama always loved violets." He folded the napkin carefully and held it out to her. When Violet reached for it, their fingers touched for just a moment. His hand was warm, calloused from years of guitar playing, completely human. "This is for you, Violet Johnson," he said quietly. "Don't let anybody tell you that you don't deserve it." Violet clutched the napkin to her chest, feeling its weight against her heart. Around her, the cafe remained silent. The customers who had been so quick to laugh were now avoiding her eyes, suddenly fascinated by their food, their coffee, anything but the young woman who had just been publicly defended by the king of rock and roll. Elvis settled back into his booth and signaled to Margaret, who had been watching the whole exchange from behind the counter with tears in her eyes. "Miss," he called to her, "could you bring my waitress here a glass of that sweet tea, on me, and make it a large one?" Margaret practically stumbled over herself to comply. She brought Violet the biggest glass they had, filled to the brim with ice-cold sweet tea, and garnished with a lemon slice they usually saved for special occasions. "Thank you," Violet managed to whisper. Elvis nodded and returned to his pie as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if he hadn't just turned a moment of cruel humiliation into something approaching grace. As if defending a young black waitress in a segregated Memphis cafe was the most natural thing in the world. But the napkin in Violet's pocket felt like it was burning against her chest. She assumed it was a simple autograph, maybe a kind word to go with his signature, something she could treasure, maybe even sell if things got truly desperate. She never imagined that folded inside that cheap diner napkin was something that would change not just her life, but the life of everyone who witnessed what happened next. 20 minutes later, Elvis finished his pie and coffee. He left a $5 tip on a $2 check, more than Violet usually made in tips all day. As he stood to leave, he paused beside her table where she was refilling salt shakers with shaking hands. He leaned down, close enough that only she could hear what he said next. "Violet," his voice was soft as summer rain, "I want you to remember something. Your worth isn't determined by what other people think of you. It's determined by what you think of yourself and what you do with the gifts God gave you." He straightened up, touched the brim of an imaginary hat like his mama had taught him, and walked toward the door. Just before he reached it, he turned back one more time. "Keep your faith," he said, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. "Don't give up." Then he was gone, stepping out into the humid Memphis afternoon, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and the memory of what kindness looked like in the face of cruelty. Violet stood in the sudden quiet of the cafe, the napkin pressed against her heart, knowing that something had shifted. She didn't yet know that her life had just changed forever. She didn't yet know that the simple piece of paper in her pocket would set off a firestorm that would reach all the way to the halls of power in Washington. All she knew was that for the first time in 7 years, someone had seen her, really seen her, and had decided she was worth defending. But it would be another 12 hours before she unfolded that napkin and discovered just how far Elvis Presley's kindness really extended. 4:30 a.m. came too early, as it always did, but this morning was different. This morning, Violet woke with something other than dread in her chest. She reached under her pillow, where she'd carefully placed the napkin the night before, afraid that sleeping might somehow make it disappear, make yesterday's miracle evaporate like a dream. The napkin was still there, still real. But in the gray pre-dawn light filtering through her apartment's thin curtains, she realized she hadn't actually read what Elvis had written. Yesterday's emotions had been too overwhelming, the moment too surreal. She'd clutched it to her heart like a talisman, but now, in the quiet, before the world woke up, she could finally look. She unfolded it carefully, as if it were made of butterfly wings. At first, she saw what she expected. To Violet Johnson, in bold, confident handwriting, then his signature, Elvis Presley. But below that, in smaller text, were words that made her heart stop. I believe in you. Don't give up. EP. Beautiful words, encouraging words, but then her eyes drifted to the bottom of the napkin, and the world tilted off its axis. There, printed in Elvis's careful handwriting, were the words that would change everything. Pay to the order of Violet Johnson, $10,000, drawn on Presley Family Trust, Bank of Memphis. Violet blinked, read it again, blinked again. $10,000. Her hands began to shake so violently she nearly dropped the napkin. $10,000. Enough for medical school with money left over, enough for her grandmother's heart surgery, enough for her sister to go to college, enough to change 3 lives forever. But as the shock wore off, doubt crept in. This couldn't be real. People didn't just hand out $10,000 to strangers, especially not to young black women in 1973 Memphis. This had to be some kind of mistake, some kind of cruel joke. Her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed a girl who looked like she'd seen a ghost. Maybe she had. Maybe yesterday had been a dream, and this was just her mind playing tricks on her, showing her what she wanted to see instead of what was really there. There was only one way to find out. The First Federal Bank of Memphis opened at 9 a.m. sharp. Violet was there at 8:45, pacing the sidewalk in her best dress, the navy blue one she wore to church, with the small tear in the hem that she'd carefully sewn up with thread that almost matched. She clutched the napkin in her sweaty palm, having read it 17 more times during the 3-hour wait. When the doors finally opened, she was the first customer through them. The teller was a young white man with slick back hair and the kind of smile that was trained to be polite but never quite reached his eyes. His name tag read, Robert. "Can I help you, miss?" Violet's voice came out as barely a whisper. I need to deposit this check." She slid the napkin across the marble counter with shaking hands. Robert unfolded it, and she watched his expression change from professional politeness to confusion to something that might have been shock. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "where did you get this?" The question she'd been dreading, because the truth sounded insane, even to her. Someone gave it to me. Yesterday." Robert studied the napkin more closely, then looked up at Violet with barely concealed suspicion. "You're saying Elvis Presley gave you a check for $10,000, written on a diner napkin?" When he said it out loud like that, it sounded even more impossible. Violet felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I know how it sounds, but—" "Miss, I'm going to need to make a phone call." Robert disappeared into a back office, taking the napkin with him. Through the glass partition, Violet could see him on the phone, occasionally glancing in her direction with expressions that ranged from skepticism to outright disbelief. Other customers were starting to notice, whispering among themselves about the young colored girl who claimed Elvis Presley had given her $10,000. The minutes crawled by like hours. Violet's heart hammered so hard she was sure everyone in the bank could hear it. What if this was all a mistake? What if she'd misread the napkin? What if she was about to be arrested for attempted fraud? Finally, Robert returned. His face was pale, his professional composure shaken. "Miss Johnson," he said quietly, "I verified the account. This check is legitimate. The Presley Family Trust has confirmed the transaction." The world went silent. Violet felt her knees buckle and had to grab the counter to keep from falling. Around her, the bank's morning quiet was broken by gasps and whispers as news spread from customer to customer. The check was real. Elvis Presley had actually given a young black waitress $10,000. By noon, the news had spread beyond the bank. By 2 p.m., it had reached the offices of Senator James Waitress, one of Memphis's most powerful politicians and a man who had built his career on keeping the South's racial order exactly as God and nature intended. Senator Waitress was not a man who tolerated disruption. He was especially not a man who tolerated disruption that involved famous white men giving enormous sums of money to young black women, because that kind of disruption had a way of giving people ideas. Dangerous ideas about equality and worth and who deserved what in the carefully structured world he'd spent 30 years building. The phone call came to the Presley Foundation at 3:17 p.m. Jenny Carter, the soft-spoken woman who managed Elvis's charitable work, answered with her usual warmth. "Presley Foundation, this is Jenny. This is Senator Waitress's office. The senator will be arriving within the hour to discuss this Johnson situation. Have your records ready." Jenny barely had time to ask what situation before the line went dead. Senator Waitress arrived 43 minutes later in a black Cadillac, followed by 2 photographers and a reporter from the Memphis Commercial Appeal. He stormed through the foundation's modest yellow house like a man on a mission, his expensive suit and perfectly styled silver hair making him look like an avenging angel of the established order. "Mrs. Carter," he announced without preamble, "I have just learned that this foundation has awarded a scholarship to a colored girl named Violet Johnson. This is politically unwise, reckless, and I demand that you cease this activity immediately and issue a public apology." Jenny Carter was a small woman, barely 5'2", with gentle eyes and graying hair. But she had not spent 20 years managing Elvis Presley's charitable work by backing down from bullies. "Senator Waitress," she said calmly, "our mission is education, not politics. Mr. Presley's wishes are very clear on this matter." "Mr. Presley's wishes," Waitress snapped, "do not supersede the natural order of things. That girl needs to learn her place, and you need to help her learn it. Cancel the scholarship, issue an apology, and this all goes away quietly. And if we refuse?" Waitress smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "Then I will personally ensure that every dollar of federal funding that supports your programs dries up. Every tax break, every grant, every bit of government goodwill that allows this foundation to operate. Gone." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Jenny felt her chest tighten as she realized the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about Violet Johnson anymore. This was about every scholarship they awarded, every life they changed, every young person who counted on the foundation's support. But as she looked at the senator's cold eyes, she thought about Elvis himself, about his own poor childhood, his own struggles, his own understanding of what it meant to be dismissed and looked down on. She thought about his handwritten note in their files. "Help the ones who need it most, the ones everybody else forgets." "Senator," Jenny said quietly, "Mr. Presley's wishes stand." Waitress's face darkened. "Then you've made your choice, Mrs. Carter. I hope that girl's college education is worth destroying everything you've built here." As he stormed out, followed by his entourage of photographers and reporters, Jenny Carter stood in the sudden silence of her office and realized that Violet Johnson's simple request for an autograph had just declared war on the entire power structure of the American South. And somewhere, in a tiny apartment across town, Violet had no idea that her dreams had just become the battleground for America's soul. The phone call came at 6:23 p.m. Violet was heating up leftover soup for dinner, trying to process the day's impossible events, when the phone rang with news that made her blood run cold. "Violet, honey, this is Jenny Carter from the Presley Foundation." The woman's voice was steady, but Violet could hear the strain beneath it. "We need to talk. Can you come in tomorrow morning? Early? Is something wrong? Is there a problem with the check?" A pause. Too long. "There might be. Senator Waitress is trying to pressure us to revoke your scholarship. He's threatening to cut our funding if we don't." The words hit Violet like a physical blow. Of course. Of course it couldn't be simple. Of course, the moment she dared to reach for something better, the whole world would conspire to tear it away from her. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll give it back. I don't want to cause trouble for the foundation." "Violet Johnson, you listen to me." Jenny's voice turned fierce. "You are not giving anything back. Elvis Presley chose to help you, and he had his reasons. Good reasons. We're going to fight this. How? He's a senator. I'm nobody. You're not nobody. You're exactly who Elvis saw potential in. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't money or political influence. It's truth." After hanging up, Violet sat in her tiny kitchen, staring at the cracked linoleum floor. Outside, Memphis hummed with its usual evening sounds. Children playing, televisions chattering, the distant rumble of traffic on Union Avenue. Normal sounds of a normal world that suddenly felt anything but normal. Then she thought about her grandmother, asleep in the next room, struggling for every breath. She thought about her sister Maya doing homework at the kitchen table, with textbooks held together by tape and hope. She thought about all the other young black women like her, invisible and forgotten, told to be grateful for scraps and never dared to want more. And she got angry. Not the helpless, swallowed-down anger she'd carried for years, but a clean, bright fury that burned away fear and left only purpose. Senator Waitress wanted a fight? Fine, she'd give him one. But she'd fight with the only weapon she had: her words, her story, and the truth of what kindness could accomplish when it met courage. Violet pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. My name is Violet Johnson. I am 19 years old. I work as a waitress at Louise's Cafe, and yesterday Elvis Presley changed my life. Not because he's famous, not because he's wealthy, but because he saw me, really saw me, when the rest of the world had decided I was invisible. She wrote about growing up poor, about watching her mother die without proper medical care, about working every day to keep her family together while dreaming of something more. She wrote about the cruel laughter in the cafe, about the way people looked through her like she wasn't even human. And she wrote about what it meant when one person decided to believe in her potential. Senator Waitress says I should know my place. He says that accepting Elvis's kindness is politically unwise, that it upsets the natural order of things. Well, let me tell you what I think is politically unwise. A society that wastes human potential because of skin color. A system that tells children their dreams don't matter because they were born poor. Leaders who think maintaining power is more important than changing lives. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. She wrote about hope and dignity, and the radical act of believing in someone who'd been told she wasn't worth believing in. When she finished, she had 5 pages of truth, raw and unvarnished. She folded them carefully and walked through the muggy Memphis night to the offices of the Memphis Gazette. The night editor, a tired-looking man named Frank Morrison, read her letter with growing amazement. Miss, do you understand what you're asking me to do? Publishing this is going to start a war. Good, Violet said simply. Some wars need to be started. The letter ran on the front page of the Memphis Gazette the next morning, under the headline, "The Waitress Elvis Believed in Speaks Out." By noon, it had been picked up by newspapers across the South. By evening, it was national news. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured in from across the country, some supportive, some hostile, all passionate. The phone at Louise's Cafe rang constantly with reporters wanting interviews. Television crews set up outside the Presley Foundation's yellow house. But more importantly, people began to act. Memphis Medical College received over 300 letters in 2 days, most of them expressing support for Violet's admission and outrage at Senator Waitress's interference. Donations poured into the Presley Foundation from across the country, small amounts from working families who understood struggle, larger amounts from wealthy donors who were moved by Violet's story. Senator Waitress found himself facing something he'd never encountered before: organized resistance from people who refused to stay quiet. His office was flooded with calls demanding he leave Violet and the foundation alone. His political allies distanced themselves from what was increasingly being seen as a petty attack on a deserving young woman. Within a week, he quietly withdrew his threats. But the real transformation was in Violet herself. The shy, invisible waitress who had asked for an autograph was gone, replaced by a young woman who spoke at community meetings, who gave interviews with confidence and grace, who had learned that her voice mattered. Memphis Medical College not only confirmed her scholarship, but fast-tracked her admission, eager to be on the right side of a story that had captured America's imagination. 3 years later, Violet Johnson graduated at the top of her nursing class. She specialized in community health, working in the same poor neighborhoods where she'd grown up, providing care to people who had been invisible to the medical establishment. Her grandmother's heart surgery was successful. Maya went on to become a teacher. The acceptance letter that had once seemed like an impossible dream became the first step in a career dedicated to healing. But the real legacy of that crumpled napkin extended far beyond one family's transformation. Elvis Presley, who had always struggled with his own role in a segregated society, found in Violet's courage the inspiration to be more open about his support for civil rights. The Presley Foundation expanded its mission, focusing specifically on helping young people from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue education. Violet's letter became required reading in journalism schools, studied as an example of how personal stories could drive social change. Her example inspired other young people to speak out, to refuse to accept limitations placed on them by others, to believe in their own worth, even when the world told them they were worthless. And every year, on the anniversary of that August afternoon in Louise's cafe, Violet would take out the original napkin, carefully preserved now in a frame on her wall, and remember the moment when kindness met courage and changed everything. The napkin itself had become something of a legend. Museums had offered to buy it, collectors had made outrageous offers, but Violet always refused because it wasn't a piece of memorabilia to be sold or displayed. It was a promise, a reminder that one person's belief in another person's potential could ripple outward in ways neither of them could have imagined. It was proof that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could shatter the biggest lies we tell ourselves about who matters and who doesn't. And late at night, when Violet would pass the frame in her hallway, she could swear she heard an echo of that familiar voice, "Keep your faith. Don't give up." She never did. Violet Johnson's story reminds us that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. She asked for help when she needed it most, and that simple act of bravery changed not just her life, but the world around her. Elvis saw something special in her that others missed, but more importantly, Violet learned to see it in herself. What would you have done in that cafe? Would you have had Violet's courage to speak out when it mattered? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe in themselves today.